Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Greta Brower, and I've also got online my colleague, Chris Chapman, and we're going to be presenting on the topic of CQM to DQM conversions within Cognos Analytics. The agenda we're going to cover today is the difference between the two query modes, what constitutes a requirement to convert, the benefits of using DQM, and then different conversion workflows we've seen. So how to structure projects for success, common pitfalls, and then other long-term architecture maintenance considerations. Okay, so first, there are a lot of abbreviations thrown around in IT and analytics, but what is CQM and DQM and why is it important to convert? So these terms are specific to IBM's analytics stack, and they really define the way that the query is generated behind the scenes when you're pulling data. So CQM is compatible query mode, or sometimes referred to as CQE, compatible query engine. It's the traditional query mode that's been used up until this point by like Impromptu, Cognos Connection version 8 into 10, and still in some situations in 11, Cognos Analytics. It runs on 32-bit and uses the client ODBC connection to data sources, whereas on the other hand, DQM is dynamic query mode or dynamic query engine. It's the more modern query engine that provides more built-in capabilities, more flexibility on how to query. And what it does behind the scenes is kind of define properties on caching and routing rules to be more efficient. So DQM requires the 64-bit connection and uses the JDBC, which requires different drivers than ODBC with the 32, so that's a consideration. One other consideration just at the get-go is by default Cognos installs as 32-bit, so for many customers a multi-server infrastructure to accommodate both run options might be required depending on your data sources, which Chris will talk about a little bit later in the presentation with the technical details. Okay, so why would you want to consider moving to DQM? There's a few situations that actually require you to move to DQM. That would be if you're going to IBM's cloud or if you're using an OLAP data source in Cognos Analytics. But even if neither of these situations apply to you, you still may want to convert because you're going to see improved query performance, and it's in line with IBM's future query engine and future direction of their technology stack. So to dig into some of the improvements that you would see if you do convert to DQM, I mentioned that the query is optimized, and that's due to caching and governance settings that you can set within Framework Manager. The caching is what I'll call like smart caching, and that it doesn't even need to reuse just full queries. It can even use bits and pieces that apply to any incoming request. It can even consider data level security when applying the caching rules, which is really cool. And then also with the relational database support via JDBC, there are some other benefits with specific governors that you might care about, like bridge querying and some other options. Okay, so the benefits of DQM sound promising and will help you advance to the cloud or utilize Cognos 11 in a better way, but how does the conversion process actually work? There's a couple different ways to structure a DQM conversion project. And when we say DQM conversion, first of all, what does that even mean? It could mean modifying reports, or it could mean modifying framework packages and also changing some aspects of the configuration to support the DQM mode. Typically, it's coupled with a Cognos 11 upgrade if it's required to move to DQM if you've got any OLAP sources, but it can also be undertaken as an independent, can be taken independent of a version upgrade. So actually, if we actually made a recommendation, it would be to do it outside of an upgrade because you are in a stable version release. You're not coupling it with change management to your users, since 11 has such a different interface. So it's a little bit more of a stable environment to just do it without coupling it with an upgrade. But some other activities you may want to consider if you are doing a DQM upgrade is making sure you leave time for things like content store cleanup, doing a lot of upfront impact analysis, understanding the report versus the model remediation, and making sure you allow plenty of time for testing and getting sign off. So I'm going to dive into each one of these a little bit deeper. First, content cleanup. One of the biggest technical differences that Chris is going to talk about is the syntax being a lot more strict with DQM. This is where a lot of the time and effort is often spent when you're converting to DQM. It's in actually modifying the reports or the logic in the framework manager to be compliant with this logic. So because of that, if you haven't been adhering to good coding practices, you may have quite a lot of cleanup work to do in the reports or the models. So before starting down this path, you probably want to reduce the amount of remediation, which means you probably want to leverage your audit store information to understand what's being used, and then roll out some sort of plan to archive content that is not being used. And you definitely want to include data sources in that. There are third-party tools like PM Square Thrive and some other tools that can help simplify the cleanup. Okay, so the actual conversion to DQM, to actually convert, you're going to log in to Framework Manager and switch a property from CQM to DQM. There's a picture in the top right corner of the slide, but it's actually as simple as that. The problem is, though, as I kind of mentioned, if your reports and model aren't compliant to the syntax, just switching the setting isn't enough. You're going to have to kind of go back and do a little bit of cleanup work. You're also going to have to make sure that you have the JDBC connection set up to support it. So you'll definitely want to start with a test in your sandbox or dev environment to get a feel for the level of effort this project's going to take you early on while you're still like defining the project plan and the level of effort and resources for the project, because we have seen conversions take just a week or two if reporting and modeling logic was all best practice, and it's basically just a lift and a shift. On the other hand, if there are reports riddled with really complex code that needs to be untangled and updated, it could be several months. So you want to make sure you do a lot of analysis up front. Okay, next is evaluate the impact. So after you make that property change in Framework Manager, you're going to want to validate the model as you usually do and then republish. Ideally, the model validates perfectly, and then after publishing the reports, they work as is, but with the syntax changes I mentioned, this may not be the case. So you can automate test cases via products like Thrive, but it requires you to define all the iterations of the prompt options that you want to test, because you want to test the different iterations of the queries, and forming queries in one way, depending on the prompt options you select, versus other ways may not test all the scenarios users actually interact with the report. So it's really important to identify what your strategy is going to be to testing. Another option that we really suggest you mix in, at least at a minimal level, is manual validation. You're going to want to make sure you include unit testing of all the reports that are updated or touched in any way to comply with the syntax requirements of DQM, and then likely do a QA process and a user acceptance testing. But even for reports that pass automated testing, you still may want to do a manual spot check. Depending on the quantity of reports, if you have a smaller environment, you may want to consider even testing all reports, or if you've got a bigger environment, maybe just a small sliver that's representative of the full population. Maybe you want to target your most highly used reports or some other combination of testing. The last piece is communication and change management, especially if you're coupling this DQM conversion activity with an upgrade, which most of our clients end up doing. The key to having a successful project is communication with the stakeholders and the users. So giving them plenty of heads up on the timeline, when they need to be involved in the project for things like testing, how much of a time commitment they need to expect, whether you're going to provide training at the end before they enter the environment, and to what level of training they should expect to receive, dates about when the new environment will be available and when the old environment's being shut down is all super important to them having a positive experience. You also want to consider as I mentioned, change management for the actual cutover. Are you going to have both environments up in parallel for a period of time? Are you going to release content in the new environment in stages or to certain groups? And really, how are you going to make content that's being modified in the meantime during the upgrade project, so you make sure to account for all of those changes that are rolling into production. So all of these expectations and assumptions should be clearly defined so there are no surprises for the users. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Chris Chapman to tell you a little more about the technical aspects of converting to DQM and the architecture and some of those syntax issues that I mentioned.
Okay, thanks, Greta. Yeah, for the remainder of the time, we're going to be looking to do a deeper dive into some of the issues that we faced and that we've seen customers face, ourselves face during these upgrades, and also take a look a bit at the underlying architecture, and then some of the ways you can look to tune and test a DQM environment for better performance. We're going to take a look at two sets of issues. Unsurprisingly, we're going to be looking at one side of the reporting, another side from the framework side. A common thread that we've seen from both sides is that older reports and older models tend to have more issues. That makes sense. If you think about it, many of you, if you have a 10, 12-year-old environment, when you first stood that up and started letting people develop against it, probably most people didn't know what they were doing. It was all new technology, new ideas, and so people threw stuff against the wall to get it to work because the business needed things, and you got things up and running. Over time, people learned and grew. Other people came in, best practices started to be followed. So newer reports, newer models, we don't see have that many issues when going through the upgrade. The main reason is the older models that weren't best practice, people may not know what they were doing, had a lot of what you're seeing up on the screen. Bad logic, ambiguous logic, and those combinations would lead to not just report failures, but variances in data when doing unit testing, or just flat out missing data points altogether. So some examples of bad logic. Conventional modeling and dimensional reporting can be intimidating for new users and out in the business. And we've seen users even going against dimensional report, data sources, baking in relational logic. For whatever reason, CQM would allow that to go through, even though it shouldn't have. However, when you flip the switch to DQM, DQM won't. DQM really cranks down the screws on what is and is not allowed from a logic point of view. Another good example, common issue that we found was the bottom count function. It actually requires 3 values in order to execute, or if you look at the tooltip, there are 3 values that it suggests you use. In CQM, you can actually only put in 2, and it'll work. I'm not completely sure why, but it's something we've seen. When you maybe flip the switch over to DQM, though, Cognos will hit the brakes and say, no, you can't do that. The ambiguous logic, so anytime you have a situation where a query doesn't have a clear determined path to execute and provide a value, this will also cause issues. We've seen the ambiguous logic throw errors in Cognos when doing the upgrade. We've also seen the below of the data variance. Running, looking at points of upgrade, running something in Cognos 10 versus Cognos 11, getting different values. Logic's the same, queries are the same, sort values are the same. Everything looks to be the same, but they're different. Even seeing situations that, running on different days will get you different hits on unit testing. So really, it comes down to how confident are you in your environment and how it's been developed and maintained will determine really the full scope of the project. If it's been old, if you have a lot of older content out there that hasn't been maintained or updated in a few years, or you have any questions on how it was developed, could be a heavy lift on getting that content moved over to DQM. And through that, we would recommend you're really evaluating to look at, say, for these reports, is it worth going through the exercise of going down the rabbit hole, which concept we use a lot because turning over one rock, fixing one issue could lead to another and another and another, depending on how the report is developed. So is it worth going down that full rabbit hole to salvage a report, or do we want to start fresh? Not saying that everyone that goes through an upgrade will need to do that, but it's something that to keep in mind if you're looking at an environment that could have a significant amount of conflict. And then on the FM side, similar story, like I said, from what we've seen, working with clients, older models, similar issues to older reports, developed by people that may not have always been known they were doing or may not have known what best practices were at the time, just got stuff working. But that has issues now. Some of the specific issues that we've seen still relate to stricter rules. Really can't stress that enough. Within DQM, I've been really crank down those rules so that you really need to follow best practice. We're CQM with what's specified, DQM will not. So a good example of that is relationship conflicts between the different layers in FM. If you have relationships through multiple layers, the database, for example, those before Cognos would just sort through and allow that to go through it, and it may cause a conflict that would actually throw an error during validation of the model. So that may be something that they need to do. Obviously, best practice would say keep all of those in the database layer. So if you know of any conflicts like that in the environment, that could cause an issue. We've also seen instances where before the schema in the table didn't necessarily need to be within the query subject definitions and the data source definitions in order to validate the model. That is no longer the case. Those need to be there. I think part of the reason for that is the caching that we'll look at before in a little bit. Metadata within DQM is very key to the caching scheme. We're going to take a look at that in a minute, but these are some of the things to keep an eye on when you're evaluating your model to see if there might be an issue. So that's what we're going to look at next is the environment and the tuning of the environment, because it takes a little different way of thinking. If you were in a high volume or high performance environment and need to tune it in order to accommodate DQM. So first, take a look at the architecture. We have on the right the wonky diagram that explains what's going on behind the scenes. The shorthand for that is before, when a request would come into Cognos, it would be given to the report service. The report service would take that, run the query, and produce the result. That's no longer the case. The query service will be doing the bulk of the heavy lifting. A request would come in. If it's a DQM request, the report service will simply acknowledge that, hand it off to the query service, and then the query service will take over from there. As Greta mentioned before, it is a heavier reliance on cache. And you can see here from the diagram just all the different areas where the cache is, all the way up to planning, transformation engine, then down to the execution with the data cache and the member cache. Within DQM, we're not just looking at pulling the result. The great point Greta made was it's an intelligent cache where you don't need an exact hit to be able to get value from leveraging the cache. Member cache is a good example, and the metadata caching scheme itself is valuable. Pulling in that metadata, knowing the structure of the data source that you're hitting to be able to intelligently go and pinpoint where a result might be if one hasn't already generated with the data cache. Still doing that as well, giving you a couple hits, storing those So if an exact hit is found, you just pull that in and use that as well. But this scheme requires a little different thinking before you're looking at, well, you know, what's my BI bus count? You know, does the report service have enough? But that's no longer the case. Well, for DQM, you know, query service size is key. So that is all handled in memory. So as far as the caches, queries, the workload is being done in memory. So you really need to make sure that the max size for your query service is enough to accommodate all that work that the query service will be doing. That said, that's not the whole story. And you still need to be mindful of the core JVM and your BI buses. Even if you expand the size of the query service, 16 gig, 32 gig, however big you want, if you have bottlenecks in those other areas, it's going to create conflict. One of the larger performance testing projects that I was involved in required tuning all three of these and also some dynamic tube settings very precisely. And it's quite a bit of work to do that, but it was a combination of all three of these that allowed the environment to run at its peak, most stable, most optimal performance. You know, speaking to the BI buses, I said it just hands it off. You know, what we found in that is, yeah, it's just handing it off, but in that handoff, it's lots of weight. So the process is spun up to handle a request, passes that through. If it's sitting there waiting for the query service to handle, it's not going to be doing anything else. So if you only have, you know, max 6 panels, all 6 of those get spun up. They're all waiting on long queries to run from the query service. You'll be sitting there spinning your wheels, creating backlog, not getting things to run through. And if there were additional BI buses, it can pass that through. Query service has enough bandwidth to do that, and it can pass those through. So just that balancing act to make sure that all three of these are in balance so that everything can run properly. And then finally on you know, with troubleshooting and also performance tuning. For individual queries, you know, the dynamic query analyzer is a tool that once you go over to DQM, it's something that you would be relevant now and would have access to and can leverage that. So this is available via download from IBM. I'm sure it's been in Passport Advantage in the DQA download file. That's what this is and its purpose. And what this is a visual representation of the query. And you can see from the screenshot on the right, an example of what it does. It's going to break out each node of the MDX, show you what's being done in each node, and then also in each flow point. So here, you know, the specific MDX select is flow, could be a slicer that you know, either been created improperly and was causing a slowness, or it's just running slow. And this way will highlight those. So if you are having performance issues within DQM, you know, report authors actually be able to go in directly and see, okay, here's specifically the node I'm having an issue with, and here's where I can go back into my report now, restructure that, and hopefully alleviate that issue. Going back to, you know, the previous point on additional performance testing, the test I mentioned earlier, looking at the query service, report service, for JVM, those were all done using WebLoad. And I think some of the previous slides mentioned some of the different ways we can test. Really, any performance testing tool that you have available to you would be valuable. WebLoad would use. In the past, I've used JMeter quite frequently. But any out there that allow you to push load against the system will give you some insight. Few things to keep in mind when you do that. Obviously, we mentioned caching is a really big component of that. So it's always, you know, keep in mind if you're using a dynamic query analyzer, if you're using a load test, if your test is configured in a way to run, you know, a small handful of reports that may have the same results at the same time, that's fine. But you're going to hit that cache really quickly and start start just hitting the cache and not going into data stores. So depending on what you're wanting to test, if you're just wanting to test the interplay between the Cognos service versus support service, that would be fine. But if you're wanting to do more intense testing on query service reaching out to the data source itself, you'll want to look at disabling as many caches as you can to make sure that you're getting an accurate representation of the environment and the goal you're trying to test. So with that, we'll open it up to any questions anyone has on the CQM to DQM conversion, and I'll be able to answer those for you now.